The council chamber fell silent as Elder Thrangs placed 3 squirming cubs on the polished stone table. Their fur, silver-tipped and marked with the sacred crescents of the Vakran bloodline, caught the light from the observation dome above. The eldest cub, barely 3 cycles old, stared at the assembled elders with eyes too knowing for his age. "These are all that remain," Thranix said, his voice heavy with centuries of grief. "The plague took their parents. It took their clan. It will take our species unless we find a solution." The Vakran had survived for millennia as the galaxy's most formidable predators. Their homeworld of Crash and Prime had bred them into perfect hunters, 6-limbed, bone-plated, capable of tracking prey across star systems through pheromone trails that lingered in subspace. But evolution had made them specialists, and specialists died when their environment changed. The plague was a cruel joke. It targeted only adult Vakran, rewriting their genetic code until their own bodies turned against them. The cubs were immune, protected by some quirk of immature biology that the galaxy's finest scientists couldn't replicate. In 5 years, the Vakran population had collapsed from billions to thousands. In another 5, there would be only cubs, orphaned, helpless, unable to learn the ancient ways of the hunt. "We need time," Thrangs continued. "Time to find a cure. Time to preserve our knowledge. But who can we trust with our future?" The Zelthani would study them as specimens. The Horthax would train them as weapons. The Merchants Guild would sell them to the highest bidder. What about the human? The question came from the back of the chamber. Ambassador Saren Hale stepped forward, her small frame dwarfed by the towering Vakran elders. She wore the standard diplomatic uniform of the Terran, coalition, practical gray with minimal decoration, but her eyes held something the Vakran recognized. The patient calculation of a hunter evaluating prey. "You want to entrust the future of the Vakran to a human?" Counselor Vexra's mandibles clicked in disbelief. "No offense, Ambassador, but your species has been spacefaring for barely 2 centuries. You have no understanding of our ways, our culture, our—" "We understand orphans," Saren interrupted quietly. "And we understand what it means to raise the next generation when everything else has failed." Thrangs studied her. Humans were strange creatures, soft-skinned, short-lived, lacking any natural weapons worthy of the name. But they had spread across the galaxy with disturbing speed, adapting to worlds that killed hardier species. And they had a reputation, whispered in the dark corners of frontier stations. Humans didn't know when to quit. 3 cubs, Thrangs said finally. "We will entrust you with 3. Teach them to survive. Keep them safe. When we have found a cure, we will reclaim them." Serene nodded. "And if you don't find a cure?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Seren named the eldest cub Rokar, after a word in the human's ancient language that meant stone. He was stubborn as bedrock and twice as immovable when he didn't want to cooperate. His siblings, Kessa and Thrym, were easier, more playful. But Rokar watched everything with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. The Vakran had provided files, cultural databases, training protocols. Seren read them all and then, with the instinct that had made humans the galaxy's most unpredictable variable, ignored most of them. She didn't raise them as Vakran. She raised them as cubs. On the human colony world of New Sarajevo, she built them a home at the edge of the wilderness. She taught them to track not through pheromones, but through broken branches and disturbed soil. She showed them how to read the behavior of prey animals, how to predict patterns, how to think 3 moves ahead. The Vakran hunt with their senses, she told Rokar one evening as they crouched in the underbrush, watching a herd of native grazers. But what happens when your senses fail? What happens when you face prey that masks its scent or hides its trail? Rokar's ear spines flicked in consideration. "We adapt. Good," Seren smiled. "Now show me." The cub melted into the forest with predatory grace, but Seren noticed he paused at the tree line, studying the herd's patterns. Not just attacking, thinking. That was the human way. That was survival. Years passed. The cubs grew into juveniles, then into young adults. The plague continued its grim work across Vakran space. The cure remained elusive. And then one morning, Seren woke to find not 3 Vakran in her compound, but 30. They had come in the night. Refugees, orphans, survivors from a dozen dying worlds. Word had spread through the remaining Vakran populations. The human on New Sarajevo was keeping cubs alive. Not just alive, thriving. Rokar stood at the gate, his silver fur now crossed with the scars of a dozen hunts. "They have nowhere else to go," he said simply. "Will you turn them away?" Seren looked at the ragged assembly of young Vakran, all staring at her with desperate hope. She thought about the resources she didn't have, the space that didn't exist, the impossibility of what was being asked. Then she thought about humans, clawing their way up from a single world to touch the stars, surviving every extinction event their planet threw at them through nothing but stubborn, bloody-minded refusal to die. "No," she said. "We'll figure it out." 5 years after Thrangs had placed 3 cubs on that stone table, a ship entered orbit around New Sarajevo. The delegation of Vakran elders descended with ceremony and formal speeches prepared, ready to reclaim the survivors of their species. They found an army instead. 67 Vakran, the youngest 12 cycles old, the eldest nearly adult by their species standard, stood in formation on the landing field. They moved with precision that made the elders' hunting instincts tingle. They carried weapons they shouldn't know how to use and wore armor marked with insignias the elders didn't recognize. At their head stood Rokar, massive and scarred and utterly confident. And beside him, small and human and smiling, stood Serene Hale. "You gave me 3 cubs," Seren said as the elders stared in shock. "I'm returning a pack of hunters." Thrank stepped forward slowly. We found no cure." "The plague continues. Within a generation, only these will remain." "Then teach them everything," Seren replied. "Because they're ready to learn. They're ready to hunt. They're ready to ensure the Vakran don't just survive, they thrive." Rokar's voice, deep and resonant, echoed across the field. "The human taught us that adaptation is the greatest weapon. That survival isn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It's about being the most stubborn, the most unwilling to surrender." He turned to his pack, and they responded with a roar that shook the air. "The Vakran will not fade quietly," Rokar declared. "We will hunt. We will adapt. We will endure." Thrangs looked at Seren, and in his ancient eyes she saw something unexpected, gratitude mixed with awe. "What did you teach them?" he whispered. Serene's smile was small but fierce. "I taught them to be survivors. That's what humans do best." In the end, the Vakran survived, not because they found a cure, but because a single human refused to let them die. Because she took 3 orphaned cubs and taught them that survival wasn't about following the old ways. It was about forging new ones. And across the galaxy, in the dark spaces between stars, other species whispered a new story. Never underestimate what humans can do with something fragile entrusted to their care. They don't just protect it, they turn it into something stronger.